She stood in a five-star kitchen every single morning, hiding a secret so devastating it could get her killed. For 2 years, Elena Vale strapped on that heavy leather apron before anyone else arrived. Not because of the dress code, but because underneath it, her collarbone sat crooked and silent, a monument to the worst night of her life. And the man who broke it? He was still out there, still collecting, still owning her. Until one morning, the most dangerous man in New York walked into her kitchen, tasted her cannoli, and asked the one question nobody was supposed to ask. If this story already has your heart pounding, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The city never truly slept, but at 4:15 in the morning, Manhattan came as close as it ever would. The streets outside Casa Nero were the color of wet ash, slick from an overnight rain that had given up somewhere around 3 a.m. and left everything smelling like rust and exhaust and something faintly sweet from the bakery 2 blocks east. Inside the restaurant, the kitchen lights hummed to life one by one, the industrial fluorescents flickering twice before they decided to commit. Elena Vale was already there. She was always already there. She moved through the prep station the way someone moves through a space they've memorized in the dark. Not gracefully, not beautifully, but efficiently. Every reach was calculated. Every pivot of her body was mapped in advance. She lifted the 60-quart mixing bowl with her right arm, always her right arm, swinging it onto the counter in a single low arc that kept her left shoulder from rotating past a certain invisible line only she could feel. She'd learned that line the hard way. She'd learned exactly where it was the night her collarbone had cracked under the weight of a man's hand, and she had filed that boundary into her nervous system like a law. The leather apron came on last. It was oversized, 3 sizes too large, technically a man's garment, heavy at the chest and wide at the shoulders. Her coworkers had made jokes about it once or twice. "You steal that off a butcher, Vale?" She'd smiled and said nothing. The apron covered the slight drop of her left shoulder, the subtle tilt she could never quite iron out of her posture, the place where bone and cartilage had knit themselves back together crooked because she hadn't gone to a hospital. Because going to a hospital meant answering questions, and answering questions meant saying his name out loud, and saying his name out loud meant Adrian would find out. Adrian always found out. She cracked her eggs over a stainless steel bowl, counting by feel, 6, 7, 8, and tried not to think about the envelope she'd mailed 3 days ago. $400. The last $400 she had before the next paycheck cleared. She'd scraped it from the emergency fund she kept in a coffee tin above the refrigerator in her apartment, the one with the dented lid she'd never gotten around to replacing, the one her sister didn't know about. Mara didn't know about most of it. That was the point. Mara was 24 years old, recovering from the kind of accident that rewrites a person's entire future. Spinal contusion from a car that had jumped a curb on Lexington Avenue 18 months ago. The driver never found. The medical bills arriving like bad weather. Continuous and indifferent. Physical therapy 3 times a week. A specialist in Queens who charged rates that made Elena's eyes sting when she looked at the invoices. Mara believed their parents had left a small insurance policy. She believed Elena was drawing it down slowly, carefully, the way a responsible older sister would. There was no insurance policy. There was only Adrian. And Adrian had understood, with the particular intelligence of men who make careers out of identifying vulnerability, that a woman who would do anything for her sister would do exactly that. Anything. Elena folded the egg mixture into the ricotta with long, patient strokes, watching the texture change. Thinking about nothing, because thinking about everything was the kind of luxury she couldn't afford before 6 a.m. The cannoli shells were cooling on wire racks along the far wall. She'd rolled them herself the previous afternoon, pressed the dough to the thickness of a playing card, fried them in oil she'd seasoned with just enough orange zest that the shells carried a ghost of citrus underneath the crunch. It was the detail nobody asked for and everybody remembered. That was Elena's entire philosophy, distilled to its core. Give them something they didn't know they were missing. She was piping the first batch of filling when the back door opened. She didn't turn around. Back doors opened all the time. Deliveries, the sous chef arriving early, the dishwasher sneaking a cigarette. She kept her eyes on the cannoli and kept the piping bag moving, left to right, steady pressure, the white cream curling into the shell like a small, perfect thing in an imperfect world. "The orange," said a voice behind her. "That's from the oil, yes?" She turned then. The man standing inside the service entrance of Casa Nero was not the sous chef and was not a delivery driver. He was somewhere in his early 40s, wearing a charcoal suit that had not come off any rack, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and eyes the color of creek water. Not quite blue, not quite gray, not quite anything she had a word for. He was looking at the cannoli shell in his hand. He had picked one up from the rack without her noticing, without asking, the way people touch things in rooms they own. Because he did own it. She knew who Luca Moretti was. Every person who worked at Casa Nero knew who Luca Moretti was. The same way people who live near a fault line know it's there even when the ground is perfectly still. He existed at the edge of their awareness, never present and always present. His name appeared on the licensing paperwork and on the placard near the front entrance. He appeared at the restaurant perhaps 4 times a year, usually for private dinners with people whose names appeared in financial newspapers. He was unfailingly polite to the staff. He tipped with a generosity that felt less like kindness and more like precision. Elena had spoken to him exactly once before, 6 months ago, when he'd passed through the kitchen after a private event and told her the Petit Four were remarkable. She had said thank you and gone back to work and filed the encounter away in the category of things that don't require further thought. Now he was standing 10 feet from her at 4:30 in the morning, tasting unfinished product, and she had no script for this. "Yes," she said, "infused during frying. It burns off mostly. What's left is subtle." Subtle is often better than obvious. He set the shell down and looked at her, not at the kitchen, at her. "You're here before your shift begins." "I like the quiet." "What time did you arrive?" 3:50. Something moved across his face that she couldn't read. "You do this every morning?" "Most mornings." He walked toward the prep station, not quickly, the way a man moves when he's already decided he's allowed to be wherever he is. He stopped at the end of the counter and looked at the shells cooling on the rack, the bowl of filling, the piping bag she still held in her right hand. He looked at the heavy leather apron. His gaze moved from the apron to her left shoulder, and Elena felt something cold and precise happen in her chest. The same sensation she got when she stepped too close to the invisible line, that warning signal that lived below conscious thought. She shifted her weight slightly to the right. His eyes tracked the movement. "May I?" He gestured toward the finished cannoli on the tray, the 2 she'd already completed, their ends dusted with pistachios and a breath of powdered sugar. She nodded. He picked one up with the same easy authority he'd used with the shell, bit into it cleanly, and chewed without theatrics. He wasn't performing appreciation. He was actually tasting it, working through the layers the way you'd read a complicated sentence. Shell first, then the cream, then the citrus ghost, then the pistachio at the finish. His expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it settled, like a judgment being reached. "Tell me about the ricotta," he said. "Sheep's milk. I strain it myself, overnight in cheesecloth. Store-bought has too much moisture. The texture collapses under the filling. Where do you source it?" "There's a small importer in the Bronx, family operation. I've been using them for 3 years. "Since before you came here?" "I brought the relationship with me." He nodded slowly, still looking at the tray. Then he said, without any change in tone, without any preparation or softening of approach, "Why are you hiding the man who broke your collarbone?" The piping bag hit the counter. Elena didn't drop it. She set it down deliberately, because she was a woman who had learned the hard way that involuntary movements were confessions. But her hand left the bag faster than she intended, and the small plastic tip clattered against the stainless steel, and the sound was very loud in the empty kitchen. She made herself look at him. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. Her voice was level. She had practiced level for 2 years. She had practiced it until it felt like a real thing, a structural element of herself, not a performance. "My collarbone is fine." Luca Moretti looked at her the way a person looks at something they've already finished deciding about. "Your left shoulder sits approximately 3/4 of an inch lower than your right. You compensate by orienting your torso 10 to 15 degrees clockwise during any bilateral task. You've done it consistently, every morning, For the 8 months you've been working in this kitchen." The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere in the back of the restaurant, a pipe knocked twice against something metal and fell silent. "You've been watching me," she said. "I watch everything in my restaurants." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He picked up the second cannoli, turned it once in his fingers, set it back down. "The apron is 3 sizes too large. The brand is a men's workwear line, not a kitchen supply company. You bought it yourself. You've worn the same one every day for 8 months, which means you bought it before you arrived here." He paused. "Which means whatever happened to your shoulder happened before Casanero." Elena's jaw was tight enough to ache. "People buy large aprons for a lot of reasons." "They do," he said, "and you would know better than I do how to explain yours." He looked at her directly then, without apology, without the practiced sympathy people used when they wanted something from you. "I'm not asking because I feel sorry for you. I'm asking because I need to understand what I'm looking at." "You're looking at a pastry chef finishing her prep work. I'm looking at a woman who is very good at surviving something she's never told anyone about." He clasped his hands behind his back and turned slightly toward the door. "The cannoli is extraordinary, by the way. I meant that without qualification." He stopped at the threshold of the service entrance and looked back once. "I'll need you to remain on the premises until this evening. I'd like you to prepare the full dessert menu for a private dinner." He said it without inflection, without threat, as though it were a scheduling note. "We can continue this conversation then, if you'd like. Or we don't have to continue it at all." He left. The door settled shut behind him. Elena stood in the kitchen for a long moment, not moving, the piping bag lying where she'd put it, the 2 finished cannoli on the tray looking back at her like small, patient witnesses. She pressed the heel of her right hand against the counter and let her weight settle into it, and she breathed, in through her nose, out through her teeth, the way she'd learned to breathe when the panic started pulling at the edges of her control. Nobody knew about the collarbone. She had told no one. Not her coworkers, not the friend she'd had before Adrian had quietly, methodically, with great patience and zero visible effort, separated her from. Not the therapist she'd seen twice before Adrian had pointed out, gently, that therapy was a place where people said things they shouldn't, that therapists kept notes, that notes could be subpoenaed. She had not told her sister because Mara had enough to carry. She had not told the woman at the shelter whose number she'd called once and then hung up before anyone answered. She had told no one. And Luca Moretti had walked into her kitchen at 4:30 in the morning and seen it in 8 months of recorded movement. She went back to piping. Her hands were steady. She made them steady. That was the thing about hands. They could be instructed if you were firm enough with yourself, if you'd had enough practice separating the physical from the internal. Elena Vale had had 2 years of practice, and she piped ricotta into cannoli shells with the mechanical grace of someone who had decided that falling apart was a thing that happened to people who had time for it. She finished the batch. She started on the millefeuille dough. At 6:15, the sous chef arrived, Marco, 28, and cheerful in the loud way of people who've never had a reason to be quiet. He came in talking about traffic and a cab driver who'd nearly clipped a cyclist on the bridge, and Elena nodded in the right places and handed him his task list and kept her eyes on her work. By 7, the full morning crew was in, and the kitchen was loud and smelled like butter and coffee and warm sugar, and Elena moved through it the way she always moved through it, precise, contained, her left shoulder slightly lower than her right, her heavy leather apron in place, her face giving nothing. At 9:47, her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She already knew who it was. Adrian Locke sent the same message every month, always a week before the due date, always just 2 words. Still waiting. It was not a question. It had never been a question. She thought about the envelope she'd mailed 3 days ago and felt the familiar mathematics of it. $400 gone. Mara's next specialist appointment in 11 days. The physical therapy invoice due the week after that. Her own rent a ghost at the back of all of it. Patient and enormous. She put the phone back in her pocket. She started on the chocolate work, tempering a sheet of dark couverture on the marble slab, spreading it with an offset spatula until it caught the light right, working the temperature down with long, even strokes. It was the kind of task that required your hands and left your mind nowhere comfortable to go, which is probably why she was doing it. She thought about what Luca Moretti had said. I need to understand what I'm looking at. She had known men who said things like that. Adrian had said things like that in the early months, before she had understood what he actually meant by understand. Adrian had used the language of perception, of insight, of wanting to know her truly. And what he had wanted, what he had actually been assembling, was a complete map of everything she cared about so that he knew exactly which things to threaten when she stopped cooperating. Luca Moretti was not Adrian Locke. She knew that the way you knew a knife from a spoon, not because you'd been told, but because the shape was different in your hand, the weight distributed differently, the edge visible at a certain angle of light. She didn't know what Luca Moretti was, but she knew he was not that particular thing. What she didn't know was whether that made him safer. At 11:20, one of the waitstaff knocked on the kitchen door and informed her that Mr. Moretti had arranged for her to use the private prep room on the second floor for the evening's dessert preparation. Private prep room. She had not known there was a private prep room on the second floor. She had not, in 8 months at Casa Nero, been above the main kitchen level. She said thank you and went back to her chocolate. At 12:45, her phone buzzed again. Not Adrian this time. A number she didn't recognize, Manhattan area code, and a text message that was not 2 words but 37. Your sister left the rehabilitation center on foot 20 minutes ago. She appears to be going to the pharmacy on 71st. Someone is following her. I thought you should know. A friend. Elena read the message 4 times. Her hand stopped moving on the spatula. The couverture was starting to set wrong, pulling away from the marble at the edges, and she didn't notice because her eyes were fixed on the screen, on someone is following her, on the way those 4 words had just rearranged every calculation she'd spent the last 2 years making. She looked up. Across the kitchen, Marco was arguing with the line cook about something involving mise en place. The dishwasher was running, the oven timers were ticking down from different numbers. Everything was exactly as it had always been, and nothing was the same as it had been 10 seconds ago. She thought about calling Mara. She thought about what she would say. She thought about what Adrian would do if she said the wrong thing. She put the phone in her pocket and pressed her right hand flat against the marble slab, cold and solid and exactly where she'd put it, and she breathed. In through her nose, out through her teeth. She had made it 2 years by being smarter than the fear, by being quieter than the pain, by being more patient than the man who was trying to wear her down. But someone had just told her that Mara was being followed. And someone else, the most dangerous man in New York, by every measure that mattered, had stood in her kitchen this morning and asked the one question she had never let anyone ask. And Elena Vale, who had spent 2 years becoming very good at surviving alone, stood in the loud, warm, butter-scented kitchen of Casa Nero, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like nausea, that alone was no longer a strategy. The question was what came next, and she didn't have an answer yet. But upstairs, in the private prep room she hadn't known existed until an hour ago, a private dinner was being prepared for guests whose names she hadn't been told. And somewhere on 71st Street, her sister was walking to a pharmacy with someone behind her. And in her pocket, a message from a friend, someone who knew her sister's schedule, knew the rehabilitation center, knew the pharmacy, knew enough to be watching, was sitting against her hip like a stone. She peeled the set coverture off the marble in a single careful sheet and carried it to the cooling rack. She had until this evening. She was going to need every minute of it. The private prep room on the second floor was not what Elena had expected. She had expected a smaller version of the main kitchen. Stainless steel, institutional, functional. What she found when she pushed open the door at 2:15 that afternoon was something closer to a laboratory crossed with a library. The counters were white marble, thick as a slab of quarried hillside. The shelving along the east wall held equipment she recognized and equipment she didn't, organized with a precision that suggested someone had thought very carefully about the sequence in which things would be needed. There was a temperature-controlled chocolate cabinet, a single-burner induction station with a copper saucier she would have paid 2 weeks' salary for, and a window that looked not onto the street, but onto a narrow interior courtyard where a single bare tree stood in a concrete planter, its branches just beginning to show the first reluctant green of late spring. She set her kit bag on the counter and stood very still for a moment, listening. The sounds of the main kitchen were muffled up here. Reduced to a low pulse of activity, she could feel more than hear. The room itself was quiet in the way that expensive rooms were quiet, not empty, but sealed, insulated from the ordinary noise of the world by walls thick enough to mean it. She thought about the text message. Someone is following her. She had called Mara at 1:15, keeping her voice at the register she used when everything was fine, asking about the therapy appointment, asking about the specialist's latest notes, listening for anything in Mara's voice that suggested she'd noticed someone behind her on 71st Street. Mara had sounded tired and a little frustrated about insurance paperwork and completely unaware that anything was wrong. She was home. She was safe. She was eating leftover soup and watching something on television, and she'd asked Elena if she was coming Sunday for dinner, and Elena had said yes, probably, and they'd hung up. Safe. For now. Elena opened her kit bag and started unpacking. She had 3 hours before the private dinner service began, and she had a full dessert menu to build from the ingredients that had been staged in the prep room with an efficiency that irritated her slightly because it meant someone had been in here recently, preparing for her, without telling her they were preparing. A small thing. The kind of small thing that, in her experience, was never actually small. She started with the millefeuille because it required the most lead time and the least forgiveness. The puff pastry had been laminated already. She could see the layers when she cut into the block, fine as paper, each one distinct. Whoever had sourced it knew what they were doing. She docked the sheets, laid them on parchment, weighted them, slid them into the oven, and set the timer without looking at it because she knew the number by feel. She was making the pastry cream when the door opened. She didn't stop whisking. Luca Moretti stepped into the prep room and closed the door behind him with the same quiet authority he'd used at 4:30 in the morning, the same absence of hesitation that she was beginning to understand was simply the way he moved through every space he occupied. He was still in the charcoal suit. He looked at the room, at her setup, at the oven timer, and then he pulled a stool from beneath the counter and sat down on it, unhurried, like a man settling in for something he'd already allocated time for. "The dinner's at 8, he said. "I know. 6 guests. 2 of them have specific dietary requirements I've had noted in the folder on the shelf." I found the folder. He was quiet for a moment. She kept whisking. The pastry cream was thickening correctly, pulling away from the sides of the pan in the way it did when the starch was activating, and she reduced the heat by 1/4 and kept moving. "Did you get the message?" he said. She stopped whisking. She turned and looked at him with the full weight of the attention she usually kept rationed and distributed, not concentrated like this, not pointed directly at one person. "That was you. It came from one of my people, yes. You had someone watching my sister. I had someone watching the man who's been watching your sister." He said it without defensiveness, without apology, in the factual register of someone reporting a weather condition. There's a distinction. There really isn't. She turned back to the stove. The cream needed attention or it would scorch, and she was not going to let 2 years of learning to stay functional get derailed by the particular anger that was currently moving through her chest like something with edges. "You don't get to make that distinction for me. You don't get to put your people near my family and then explain it as a favor." "I didn't say it was a favor." "Then what was it?" He was quiet long enough that she glanced back at him. He was watching her hands on the whisk, not her face, her hands. "Information," he said finally. "You had a right to know." "And who decided I had a right to know?" "You?" She pulled the cream off the heat and set it to cool, pressing plastic wrap directly against the surface to stop a skin from forming, moving with the efficiency of a woman who had learned to have arguments and cook simultaneously because both were things that didn't wait. "I've been handling this situation for 2 years without anyone's information. I don't need you constructing a picture of my life from the outside and then handing me pieces of it." "Elena." He said her name the way people said it when they wanted you to stop moving and look at them, and she hated that it worked, that she did stop, that she turned. "The man following your sister this morning works for Adrian Locke. I know who Adrian Locke is. I know what he does and who he does it for and approximately how much money moves through the structures he manages." He paused. "I also know that the source of his leverage over you isn't financial. It's your sister's medical debt and your belief that he can make it worse. The kitchen was very quiet. How long? She said. How long have I known? How long have you been building this? He didn't look away. 6 weeks. After I noticed the compensation pattern in the way you move, I had your employment background reviewed. That's standard practice for everyone at this level of the restaurant. It took my people 4 days to identify the assault and another 10 to find the connection to Locke. He clasped his hands on the counter in front of him, a gesture that managed to look neither threatening nor conciliatory, just present. I want to be clear about what I didn't do. I didn't approach you. I didn't alert Locke that I was aware of him. I didn't use what I found. Until this morning. Until this morning. He acknowledged it without flinching, because the timeline shifted. What timeline? He looked at her for a moment with those creekwater eyes, measuring something she couldn't identify, and then he said, Adrian Locke has begun moving money out of the shell corporations he manages, quickly, in a pattern that indicates he knows someone is looking at those structures from the outside. He leaned forward slightly on the stool. My organization has been building a case against the syndicate he serves for almost 3 years. If Locke disappears the money before we can document the trail, that case collapses. Elena put her hands flat on the marble counter and looked at them for a moment. Her knuckles, the calluses along her right palm from the whisk handle, the faint scar along her left index finger from a mandolin accident in her first professional kitchen a lifetime ago. Ordinary hands, hands that had spent 2 years doing ordinary work in service of a situation that was, she was now understanding, not ordinary at all. You want something from me, she said. Yes. Tell me what. He was quiet for just a beat too long, and she felt the shape of the silence before he filled it. 2 years ago, you spent 6 months in a relationship with Adrian Locke. During that time, you had access to his home office, his work materials. Another pause. My people believe there are account numbers, routing codes, identifiers for the shell structure that Locke never digitized, never committed to any server or hard drive, because he's careful. He keeps the architecture in physical form, or he keeps it memorized, or he shares it with someone he trusts and then uses that sharing as leverage. Elena did not move. You memorized them, Luca said. It was not a question. The oven timer went off. She crossed to it and silenced it and pulled the parchment sheets of pastry, and her hands were steady. She made them steady because the alternative was not something she was willing to demonstrate in front of this man. She set the sheets on the cooling rack and pressed each one firmly with the back of a spatula to keep the layers from separating as they cooled, and she did it with the full focus that precision pastry required, and she did not say anything for almost 45 seconds. What I know or don't know, she said finally, is not something I'm going to discuss with you in exchange for whatever it is you're implying you can offer. I'm not offering an exchange. Everyone offers an exchange. Elena. His voice didn't rise, it never rose. She was beginning to understand that about him. He didn't need volume because he never lost the thread, never got rattled enough to reach for it. I am telling you that the situation you've been managing alone is larger than you know, and that it has reached a point where the people Locke works for are beginning to ask questions about the organizations connected to Casanero, which means they are close to asking questions about me, which means the isolation you've been relying on is about to end, whether you want it to or not. She turned and faced him properly. You're telling me I don't have a choice? No. Something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, but a different quality of directness. I'm telling you the choice you've been making, silence, containment, endurance, has a shorter horizon than you think. What you decide to do with that information is yours. They looked at each other across the prep room, the cooling pastry between them on the rack, the smell of butter and caramelized sugar hanging in the sealed air. Elena felt the familiar calculation running in the back of her mind, the one she'd been running for 2 years. Cost, risk, exposure, what Mara could and couldn't afford to know. The calculation had always come out the same way. Silence. Keep moving. Send the money. Hold the line. The calculation was giving her a different answer now. She didn't say that. The dinner's at 8, she said instead. He looked at her for one more moment, then stood from the stool. It is. Then I have work to do. He nodded, once, and left. She stood in the quiet prep room for exactly 10 seconds after the door closed, 10 seconds of just breathing, and then she went back to the pastry cream. By 4 o'clock, she had the mille-feuille components staged, the chocolate work begun, and a panna cotta setting in 6 individual ramekins in the temperature-controlled cabinet. She had also made a decision that she hadn't fully articulated to herself yet, the way you sometimes understood what you'd chosen before you had the words for it, the decision living in your hands before it reached your mouth. She took out her phone and called a number she hadn't dialed in 14 months. It rang twice. "I didn't think you'd call," said the woman on the other end. Diane Yo, former colleague, former friend, current senior investigative reporter for a financial crime desk at a publication Elena had read once and then avoided because seeing Diane's byline made her feel the specific nausea of paths not taken. They had been close before Adrian. Adrian had described Diane as a person who used her connections to advance her career at the expense of the people she claimed to care about. He had said it slowly, over time, with specific examples that had seemed so reasonable in the moment, and in retrospect were so obviously constructed. Elena had pulled away. Diane had let her, which was either respect or exhaustion, and Elena had never determined which. "I need to ask you something," Elena said. "Okay." "Adrian Locke, do you know that name?" A pause, not a surprised pause, a careful one. "Yes." "How well?" "Well enough that I'm surprised you're saying it to me." Another pause. "Elena, where are you right now?" "At work." "Are you safe?" It was such a direct question that it landed somewhere unprotected, under the apron and the composure and the 2 years of careful construction. She pressed her back against the wall beside the window and looked at the bare tree in the courtyard and said, "Define safe." "Are you in immediate danger?" "No." "Has he threatened you recently?" "Diane." Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "I'm not calling to report anything. I'm calling because I think there's something larger than what I've been looking at, and I think you might know the shape of it." A long silence. Long enough that Elena thought the call had dropped, and then Diane said quietly, "How much do you know about the structures he manages?" "Enough." "Elena." Diane's voice had changed register, lower and more deliberate, the voice she used on the record. "I have been building a story about those structures for 16 months. I have sources inside 2 federal agencies, and I have documentation that would put Adrian Locke in a cell for the rest of his adult life. The one thing I don't have, the one piece that every source says exists and that I cannot locate, is the original account architecture, the internal routing identifiers for the shell structure before it was layered." A beat. "Do you have any idea what I'm describing?" Elena closed her eyes. 2 years ago, on a Tuesday evening in October, she had come home from a long shift and found Adrian at his desk, the desk he kept locked when he left the apartment and unlocked while he worked. He had been on the phone and had waved her away with the particular impatience he used before he started using other things, and she had stood in the doorway for a moment before leaving, and in that moment she had seen the screen of the laptop, the columns of numbers, the alphanumeric sequences that meant nothing to her professionally, and that her memory, her stubborn, precise, kitchen-trained memory for quantities and ratios and sequences, had recorded anyway the way it recorded everything, automatically, the way breathing was automatic. She had never written them down. She had never told anyone. She had carried them for 2 years in the same internal space where she carried the exact temperature at which couverture chocolate began to bloom, the precise ratio of cream to yolk in a perfect creme brulee, the number of grams of sugar in the first batch of cannoli filling she had ever made professionally. "Yes," she said. "I know what you're describing." Diane breathed out, a single, controlled exhale. "We need to meet." "Not yet." "Elena, I said not yet." She pushed off the wall and moved back to the counter, to the work, because standing still made everything worse. "I need 24 hours. I've been waiting 16 months. I know. Give me 24 hours. She paused. "And Diane, who else have you talked to about this? Specifically, has anyone connected to a man named Luca Moretti ever contacted you or appeared in any of your sourcing?" Another careful silence. "That's a very specific name." "I know it is." I'd need to think about that before I answered you. Think fast, Elena said, and ended the call. She put the phone face down on the marble and stood over it, her right hand resting on the counter, her left shoulder aching with the low, persistent ache that had become the background condition of her existence. And she thought about the geometry of what she'd just discovered. Luca Moretti's organization, building a case for 3 years. Diane Yo, building a story for 16 months. Federal agencies, 2 of them, with sources inside. All of them circling the same structure. All of them missing the same piece. And Elena Vale, pastry chef, survivor, woman who had memorized numbers she'd never meant to memorize, standing in a private prep room in a restaurant owned by a man whose entire apparatus of power was currently pressing against the same wall from the opposite side as everyone else. She was the door. She had always been the door. She just hadn't known what it opened onto. At 5:40, Marco called up from the main kitchen to ask a question about the evening's savory menu, and in the same breath, with the careless ease of a young man who found everything equally interesting, mentioned that there were 2 men in a parked car on the street outside the restaurant who'd been there since 3:30 and hadn't moved. He thought it was probably nothing, maybe city inspectors, maybe a real estate thing. Who knew? He laughed and went back to his question about the sauce reduction. Elena answered his question. She did not mention the car. At 6:10, she was plating the first components of the chocolate course when her phone buzzed on the counter. Adrian. Not 2 words this time. A phone call, which he almost never used, preferring the distance and deniability of text. She looked at the screen for 4 buzzes, watching his name light up and go dark in rhythm, and then she answered it. "I know you've been talking to people," he said. No greeting. His voice was the voice she remembered from the end, after the careful warmth had been stripped away, and what remained was the structure underneath, which was cold and efficient, and without interest in anything except result. "I want you to understand what that means for your sister's situation." "Mara's situation is a medical condition," Elena said, "not a situation you have any control over. I have control over the debt servicer on her physical therapy account. I have control over whether that account gets flagged for irregularities and referred to a collection process that would take her years to resolve." He paused. "I also have control over whether the very generous private arrangement we've maintained continues or whether the people I work with learn that you've been sitting on information that belongs to them." Her hand was tight on the phone. She unclenched it deliberately, finger by finger. "What is it you think I know, Adrian?" "Don't." His voice went flat. "Don't perform confusion with me. I watched you in that doorway. I've had 2 years to think about what you could see from that doorway. And now someone is pulling threads on the structures I manage. And the only new variable in my life in the past 3 months is that you work for a man whose name has recently become interesting to my employers." A pause that had weight in it, like a stone dropped into water. "I want to meet. Tonight. Midnight. Behind the restaurant. Come alone or don't come at all, because if you don't come, I will make the call about your sister's accounts before sunrise, and I will make a second call that you will not be able to undo." Elena looked out the window at the bare tree in the courtyard. The branches were very still. "Midnight," she said. "Alone." "I heard you." She ended the call. She picked up her offset spatula and went back to the chocolate plate, and she finished it with the same patient precision she brought to every element of her work, the same attention she had trained herself to sustain regardless of what was happening in the other rooms of her life. And when the plate was done, she stood back and looked at it, and it was exactly right, every component exactly where she'd intended it, the kind of precise and deliberate beauty that required the complete suppression of everything that wasn't the work. She could do midnight. She had been doing midnight for 2 years. What she had not done, what she had never done, was walk into midnight knowing the geography of it had changed completely. That the man she was meeting was no longer the only dangerous person in the city who knew her name. That the numbers she carried in her memory had moved from being leverage over her to being leverage. She held that the careful silence she'd maintained for 2 years had already been broken by the simple fact of Luca Moretti walking into her kitchen and asking the right question at the wrong time. She wiped the edge of the plate with a clean cloth. She had 6 hours. She carried the plate to the staging area and set it under the heat lamp and turned to begin the next component. And she did not let herself think about what midnight behind the restaurant would look like, or who might be watching, or whether the decision she was assembling in the back of her mind, the one she hadn't fully named yet, the one that felt irreversible and right and terrifying in equal measure, was the kind of decision a person came back from. She already knew the answer to that last one. She had known it since the moment she'd said, "I know what you're describing," to Diane Yo on the phone, since the moment she had felt the weight of what she was holding shift from burden to something else, something that had no clean name but felt, for the first time in 2 years, like it was pointing forward instead of. She finished the dinner service at 11:14. 6 plates of milfeuille, 6 panna cottas unmolded with the precision of a surgeon, 6 individual chocolate compositions that the guests, whose names she still didn't know, whose faces she'd never seen, who existed to her only as dietary requirement notes on a folder shelf, had apparently received with enough approval that one of Luca's men came upstairs to relay the compliment. She had nodded and kept cleaning. She broke down the prep room with the same methodical attention she'd used to build it, returning equipment to its designated position, wrapping and labeling and storing with the automatic competence of someone who had spent her professional life understanding that the work didn't end when the product left your hands. At 11:30, she washed her face in the small bathroom adjacent to the prep room and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. Not long. She'd learned not to look too long. There was a version of herself in mirrors that knew things she wasn't ready to hear. She retied her hair. She left the apron on the hook behind the door. She took the stairs down. The main kitchen was quieter at this hour, the night crew running cleanup, the industrial dishwasher cycling through its final load, the smell of the evening service lingering in the tile and metal like a record of everything that had happened. Marco had gone home at 10. The sous chef was doing his closing checklist at the pass. Elena moved through the kitchen without stopping, through the service corridor, and out the back door into the narrow alley behind Casa Nero. The night was cold for late spring. The alley smelled like the restaurant's exhaust vents and wet concrete, and something floral from the garden 2 buildings over that she couldn't identify in the dark. A single security light over the back door threw a yellow cone onto the pavement that ended about 8 feet out, and beyond that the alley went gray and then dark. She stood in the yellow light and waited. At 11:52, footsteps came from the left, from the direction of the cross street, unhurried, and Adrian Locke stepped into the edge of the light wearing a coat she didn't recognize over a suit she did, the charcoal one he wore to meetings he considered important. He looked exactly the same as he always looked, tall, easy in his posture, handsome in the way of men who have learned to use their appearance as a professional instrument. She had spent 8 months believing that ease, that handsomeness, was evidence of something real about him. It was the clearest measure she had of how good he was at what he did. He stopped 6 feet from her. They looked at each other. "You came alone," he said. "You told me to." "I didn't think you would." "I'm full of surprises." She kept her hands at her sides, visible, her weight balanced on both feet, her left shoulder doing what it always did, carrying its invisible penalty in silence. "Say what you need to say, Adrian." He studied her face with the particular attention he'd always paid to her, the attention that had once felt like being truly known by someone, and that she now understood was simply assessment, continuous and clinical, the same way he would look at a contract or a set of numbers. "You've been talking to people," he said. "I know it was more than one. I know one of them is Diane Yo." She kept her face neutral. "Diane is a friend. Diane is a reporter." He said it without heat, just correction. "And she's been building something for over a year that several people I work with are aware of and have been managing. The fact that you called her today means she now knows you exist in this context." He tilted his head slightly. "Which means you can't take it back." "I know." Something moved in his expression, a small recalibration, almost imperceptible, the kind of micro-adjustment she'd learned to read the way she read changing textures in dough. "You're not scared," he said. "I'm tired," she said. "That reads similarly, from the outside." He was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet she heard what she'd been listening for since he'd stepped into the light. The quality of his attention, whether it was the attention of a man in control of the situation or the attention of a man who was controlling his response to a situation that had moved outside his control. She had lived inside his attention for 8 months. She knew its frequencies. He was scared. He was hiding it with the same competence he hid everything, but it was there. in the slight over-deliberateness of his stillness, in the way his weight was marginally too far forward on his feet, in the fact that he was here at all instead of making calls from a safe distance the way he preferred. "The numbers," he said. "What about them? You know what I'm asking. Say it plainly." His jaw tightened by a fraction. "The account architecture, the routing identifiers for the original structure. You saw them on my screen 2 years ago, and your memory is—" He paused, as if choosing the word cost him something. "Exceptional. I've always known that. I should have been more careful." A pause. "I need to know what you've shared and with whom. And if I've shared everything with everyone, then this conversation becomes very different. Is that a threat? It's a description of consequences." He took one step closer, just one, and the light caught the side of his face in a way that showed the tiredness under the control, the specific exhaustion of a man who had been maintaining a performance for a very long time. "Elena, I don't want to hurt you. I never wanted—" "Don't." Her voice came out flat and final, and she didn't raise it, because she'd learned from him, among other things, that volume was a substitute for authority, and she didn't need a substitute. "Don't do the voice. I know every version of that sentence, and I know what comes after every version. Say what you actually mean, or stop talking." He looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his posture shifted. Not a collapse exactly, but a reduction, the performance coming down a register. "I need those numbers," he said. "If the structure gets exposed before I can move the assets, the people I work for will not make the distinction between my liability and your involvement. They will look at you as a loose end, and I won't be able to manage that. You're telling me the people you work for will come after me. If the trail leads to you, yes. And your solution is for me to give you the numbers so you can disappear the money before anyone can document it. My solution is for both of us to survive the next 72 hours. His voice was lower now, stripped of the professional smoothness. "I know you're angry. I know you have every reason. I'm not asking you to forgive anything. I'm asking you to be practical." "Practical," she repeated. "You're very good at it." She looked at him standing in the yellow light of the alley and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was a profound and total clarity. Not calm, not peace, nothing soft like that, but the specific crystalline quality of a decision that had finished forming. The decision she'd been assembling since 6:10, since she'd ended his phone call and gone back to the chocolate plate, since she'd stood in the prep room with her right hand on the marble and understood that the numbers she carried were no longer a secret that protected her, but a door that could not stay closed. "I'm not giving you anything," she said. The alley went very quiet. "Elena, I'm not giving you the numbers. I'm not withdrawing from any conversation I've had with anyone. I'm not sending another payment, and I'm not managing your consequences." She felt her heartbeat in her left shoulder, the specific ache of it, and she let it be there, didn't suppress it, didn't reroute her attention away from it. "I'm done." He stared at her. "You understand what—" "I understand exactly what." She held his eyes. "And I'm done." For 3 seconds he was perfectly still. Then he moved. Not toward her. Sideways half a step, his right hand coming up in a gesture that was partly dismissal and partly signal. And Elena registered the signal a half beat too late, registered it in the shift of air behind her left shoulder, the soft sound of weight redistributing on concrete that was not her weight and not his. She turned. There were 2 men in the alley behind her, between her and the back door of the restaurant. They had come from the building's service recess, from the shadow she hadn't checked because she'd been focused on the direction Adrian had come from, and the mistake of it landed in her stomach like cold water. "I did ask you to come alone," Adrian said from behind her. His voice had returned to its professional register, all the stripped-down honesty of 30 seconds ago carefully replaced. "I didn't say I came alone." She didn't run. Running was what your body wanted to do when this happened, and running was what got you caught, because the impulse to run consumed all the processing you needed for something better. She stood where she was and turned back to face him, and she measured the distance between herself and the 2 men, and herself and Adrian, and the 8 feet of yellow light between her and the back door. "You have 2 choices," he said. "You get in a car with me, and we continue this conversation somewhere more appropriate, or my associates help you get in the car." "There's a third option," she said. "There isn't." There's always a third option. She said it without bravado, just as a statement of the organizational principle she'd operated by for 2 years. The third option was the one nobody offered you, the one you had to locate yourself, in the gap between the two choices someone else had constructed. She was looking for it right now, running the geometry of the alley, the position of the men, the distance to the door, the one working security camera above the entrance that she'd noticed had a 70-degree angle. The back door of Casa Nero opened. Light spilled into the alley. One of the night crew stepped out with a trash bag, saw the tableau, Elena, Adrian, 2 men in the shadows, and stopped completely, the trash bag swinging from his hand, his face cycling through confusion toward something more alert. "Hey," he said, uncertain. "Elena? You okay?" Adrian's men shifted. Adrian's expression tightened by a precise degree, and Elena said clearly, in the voice she used when she needed to be heard over a loud kitchen, "Call Marco. Tell him I said the oven in prep 2 is on." It was not a message about an oven. It was not a message for Marco. She did not have a code with the night crew dishwasher whose name was Thomas and who had been working Casa Nero for 11 months. She had no code with anyone, but Luca Moretti's people were in this building. She had understood that since the moment she'd found the prep room perfectly staged, since the moment his man had come upstairs with the compliment from the dinner guests, they were here. They were paying attention to the restaurant, and if any one of them heard a message relayed at midnight from Elena to Marco about an oven in a room that didn't have an oven, they would know something was wrong. It was not a plan. It was a fraction of a plan, which was the most she had. Thomas looked at her for one more second, and she looked back at him with everything she had that wasn't panic, steady, certain, the look of a person who knows what they're asking. And he turned and went back inside, the door swinging shut behind him. The darkness resettled. Adrian stepped forward and took her arm above the elbow, his hand closing with the practiced grip of someone who had done this before, who knew exactly how much pressure kept a person moving without causing visible damage, and she felt it in her left shoulder immediately, the pain tracking up from the joint in a bright line, and she did not make a sound. "Walk," he said quietly. She walked. They moved out of the yellow light into the dark section of the alley, toward the cross street and whatever was parked there, and Elena counted her steps and measured her breathing and kept the pain in her shoulder as a separate fact, something she was aware of without being governed by, the way she'd been keeping it for 2 years. 22 steps from the back door. 23. She heard the door open again behind her. Not Thomas. The footsteps were different. More than one person, moving with the deliberate quiet of people who were not surprised by what they found. Adrian heard it too. His grip on her arm changed character, went from controlling to reactive, and she felt the change and dropped her chin and drove her right elbow back into his solar plexus with every pound of force her 5'4" frame could concentrate into a single point. He released her. She moved left, off the line, the way you moved when you understood that staying in the trajectory of whatever was coming was always worse than the uncertainty of the edge. And the alley erupted into the controlled chaos of men who knew each other's positions without speaking. Adrian's 2 men and whoever had come through the door, and she pressed herself against the brick wall and slid toward the cross-street end, not running, moving fast and low and close to the wall where the light didn't reach. She made the cross street. She stopped. 30 feet back down the alley, the situation resolved in seconds. She heard it more than saw it. The specific sounds of a confrontation that ended quickly because one side was significantly more prepared than the other. Adrian's voice once, sharp and controlled. Then nothing. Then Luca Moretti's lieutenant, Caruso, she'd heard his name used in the kitchen once, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with the face of someone who'd been making difficult decisions since before Elena was born, walked out of the alley and looked at her standing on the cross street with her back against the building, her right hand pressed over her left shoulder, her breathing audible in the quiet. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Mr. Moretti would like you to come inside." "Where's Adrian?" "Secured." "His men?" "Also secured." She looked at him. "How long were you in that alley?" "Long enough." He said it without apology, which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated an apology. Thomas relayed the message at 12:03. We were already positioned. He paused. You weren't supposed to come out here alone. Nobody told me that. Mr. Moretti assumed you understood. Mr. Moretti, she said, assumes a lot of things about what I understand. She pushed off the wall and straightened and felt her shoulder settle back into its chronic position, the low ache reasserting itself like a signature, proof of authorship. Fine, let's go inside. Luca was in the private dining room on the ground floor, the one used for events, currently empty of everything except a table with 2 chairs and a lamp in the corner, throwing warm light across the dark wood floor. He was standing at the window when she came in, looking out at the street, and he turned when he heard her and looked at her the way he'd looked at her that morning, assessing, without pretense, without the social performance of concern. You went out there alone, he said. Yes. I asked you to stay on the premises. You didn't ask. You told me. And I don't take instruction well from men I've known for less than 24 hours. He looked at her shoulder. She was still holding her hand over it, and she made herself lower her arm, slowly, the pain flaring once as the joint resettled. His expression didn't change, but something around his eyes did, a tightening that wasn't anger. Sit down, he said. I'm fine standing. Elena. Not an order this time. Something else. Please sit down. She sat. He pulled the other chair around and sat across from her, closer than the table would have suggested, close enough that she could see the tiredness in his face. Not the performance of tiredness, not a strategic vulnerability, but the real thing. The kind that came from too many midnights like this one, too many alleys, too many conversations that ended in the specific silence of contained violence. Adrian is in a room downstairs, he said. He's not harmed. He won't be harmed. What happens to him next is not something I control. Federal prosecutors have been aware of his location for the past 6 hours. You called the federal prosecutors. My attorney contacted the appropriate parties, yes. He looked at her steadily. I told you the timeline had shifted. This is what I meant. She absorbed that. You moved without telling me. I moved when you went out that door. His voice was even, but the evenness was working at something. When Thomas relayed your message, I understood you were already in the alley with him. I didn't have time to consult you. And before tonight, you've been moving for weeks. In ways that didn't require your involvement, yes. She looked at the lamp in the corner, at the way the light fell across the floor in a warm rectangle that stopped exactly at the edge of the shadow, a clean line. You used me, she said. Not an accusation exactly, more like a finding, something she was turning over, examining the underside of. I investigated you, he said. I made decisions about my own operation based on what I found. I did not ask you to do anything you didn't choose to do. You walked into my kitchen and asked me the one question designed to make me feel like someone finally saw me. She looked at him. That wasn't accidental. He held her eyes without looking away. No, he said. It wasn't. So it was calculated. It was both things. He said it without flinching. I calculated that you had information I needed. I also... He stopped, and the stop was the most unguarded thing she'd seen from him, a genuine interruption in the fluency of a man who was rarely at a loss. I also found that watching you move through that kitchen every morning, managing what you were managing alone with the precision you were maintaining, another pause, shorter, I found it difficult to continue doing nothing. She sat with that for a moment. That's not an apology, she said. No, he agreed. It's an explanation. I'm not sure I can apologize for it. I'm not asking you to. She pressed the heel of her hand briefly against her left shoulder, just once, the pressure a kind of acknowledgement. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. All right, the account numbers, the routing identifiers. She watched his face. You already had them, didn't you? Or enough of them to build the case without mine. Something moved across his expression. Not guilt exactly, but the recognition of being accurately read by someone who hadn't been expected to read that clearly. He was quiet for 3 seconds. We had 62% of the structure done, he said. The federal case required a higher threshold of documentation to withstand the defense the syndicate's attorneys would mount. Your information would bring it to near certainty. He paused. But the case could have proceeded without you. The room was very quiet. Elena felt the shape of what he'd just said settle into the space the way temperature settled into dough. gradually changing the texture of everything it touched. The case could have proceeded without her. She had not been the door. She had been, what? A more efficient route, a shorter path to the same destination. Her 2 years of silence and management and careful survival had been, in the architecture of this larger thing, a detail, an asset, a variable they would have liked to have and could have operated without. She had believed she was carrying something irreplaceable. She had been carrying something useful. "I see," she said. Her voice was steady. She was very good at steady. "Elena, I understand." She stood up because sitting was no longer something she could do, and she moved to the window and looked at the street outside. The late-night quiet of it, the occasional cab, the lights of the building across the way with its 2 lit windows like eyes. "I'm not—" She stopped, recalibrated. "I need you to tell me what happens now, to Adrian, to Mara's debt, to this." She gestured not at the room specifically, at the aggregate of everything. "Tell me the actual shape of what comes next." He stood as well. He came to stand beside her at the window, not close enough to crowd her, just present, in the same space. "Adrian will be processed and charged. The financial documentation, including whatever you're willing to provide, goes to the prosecutors. The syndicate's assets get frozen in the next 48 hours. The people they employ to manage problems." He said it with the careful neutrality of a man who knew exactly what managing problems meant. "Will have more urgent concerns than a pastry chef and her sister. And Mara's debt is something I can make disappear before sunrise if you want me to." She turned and looked at him. "And what does that cost me?" He looked back at her, and for the first time since she'd walked into this room, something in his face was fully unguarded. The calculation gone, the performance gone. Just a man who was tired and had done a difficult thing and was standing in the consequence of it. "Nothing," he said. "It costs you nothing." She studied his face for a long time. Then her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Not the one from this morning. Different area code, a number she didn't recognize, and a message of 4 words that made the floor of the entire careful conversation they'd just had fall away completely. "Diane Yo is dead." Elena's hand went cold. She read it again. The words didn't change. She looked up at Luca and turned the screen toward him and watched his face go through something she had never seen it go through. A sequence of responses that moved too fast to individually name, landing finally on an expression that was not composure, but the thing underneath composure when composure has been momentarily stripped. "When?" he said. "It just came in." He pulled out his own phone and stepped away from her, making a call in low, rapid Italian. And Elena stood at the window with her cold hand around her phone and looked at the street below and understood, with the particular clarity that only arrived when everything else had been removed, that the case and the numbers and the alley and Adrian in a room downstairs and all the careful maneuvering of the past 24 hours had just become secondary. Someone had killed Diane Yo, which meant someone knew, which meant the syndicate had not been waiting for federal prosecutors to build a case. They had been building their own response, moving in their own timeline, and that timeline had just produced a body. And Diane, who had spent 16 months building a story, had made a phone call this afternoon after Elena's call, in which she had, Elena was certain, with the cold certainty of someone who knew how a reporter's mind worked, made calls to sources. Multiple sources. Sources inside federal agencies, she had said. Sources who might, if any one of them was not what they appeared to be, have relayed the information upward to exactly the people who needed to know that a conversation had taken place, that a name had been spoken, that a door had been found. The door. She was the door after all, just not the door she'd thought she was opening. Luca ended his call and turned back to her, and the expression on his face told her what she already knew, that the geometry of the next 24 hours had just changed in a way that could not be unchanged, that the careful architecture of federal cases and managed timelines and controlled variables was being dismantled from the outside by people who were not interested in timelines or control, who had their own answer to the problem of Elena Vale, and everyone who had come too close to the numbers she carried. "We need to move," he said. "Where?" "Somewhere that isn't here." He was already moving toward the door. "Can you walk?" She looked at him. I've been walking with a broken collarbone for 2 years, she said. I think I can manage. But as she followed him out of the dining room and into the corridor and toward the back of the restaurant where Caruso was waiting with two other men she didn't know, she understood that walking was no longer the operative question. The operative question was what she was walking toward, and whether the woman she had been for the past 2 years, contained, precise, surviving, was the right person for what came next, or whether what came next required something she hadn't used in so long she wasn't certain she still had it. The back door opened into the alley, which was empty now, swept clean of everything that had happened an hour ago, just wet concrete and yellow light and the smell of the night. She stepped through it, and somewhere across the city, in an apartment or an office or a car moving through late-night streets, someone who did not yet know that Elena Vale had just stepped out of Casa Nero with Luca Moretti's men was about to find out, because someone always found out. That was the first law of the life she'd been pulled into. And when they did, the last version of her old existence would end, and the only question that would matter was whether she was ready to become something the old version never had been. Not a survivor of what had been done to her, but a woman who decided what happened next. She was not sure she was ready. She walked anyway. The car was a black SUV parked in the cross street, engine running, Caruso behind the wheel with the particular stillness of a man who had been waiting in running vehicles for most of his adult life. Luca opened the rear door, and Elena got in, and he followed, and the door closed and they were moving before she'd finished pulling her seatbelt across, the city sliding past the tinted windows in streaks of orange light and dark. Nobody spoke for 2 blocks. Then Luca said to Caruso in English, which she understood was for her benefit, "What do we have on Yale?" "Apartment on the Upper West Side. Neighbor found her at 11:40. Building called it in." Caruso's eyes stayed on the road. "It's being managed as a natural causes situation at this point. Whoever did it was clean." "How long between Elena's call and the body?" 7 hours, approximately." "Fast." "Very." Elena looked at the back of Caruso's head and then at the city outside the window. 7 hours. She had called Diane at 1:15. By 8:15, someone who had learned about that call had made a decision and executed it, which meant the information had moved in under an hour, which meant someone close to the operation, close to the federal investigation, close to the sources Diane had cultivated over 16 months, had been carrying that information directly to the syndicate. "There's a source inside the federal case," she said. Luca looked at her. "Yes." "You knew." "We suspected. We didn't know the depth of access." He said it without evasion, without the polished management of information she'd been watching him apply for the past 24 hours. Something had changed in the car. The death of Diane Yo had removed a layer of strategic patience from him, and what was underneath was harder and more direct. The timing of tonight tells us more than 6 weeks of surveillance did. Diane's sources inside the federal agencies, one of them was syndicate placed. Almost certainly. And when I called Diane and named Adrian Locke and asked about Luca Moretti, she stopped, felt the weight of the chain completing itself, link by link. Within the hour, someone had my name and Diane's name and the specific question I'd asked, and they made a call. Yes. She looked at her hands in her lap. So they know about me. They know you exist. They know you've been at Casa Nero. They know your name was connected to Adrian Locke 2 years ago. He paused. Whether they know what you carry is what we don't know. They'll assume, she said. If they were careful enough to have a source inside a federal investigation, they're careful enough to assume the worst. Yes. The car turned north, then west, the streets widening and quieting as they moved away from the restaurant district. Elena pressed the back of her head against the seat and looked at the ceiling of the SUV and let herself feel for exactly 5 seconds the full weight of what the night had become. Diane dead, Adrian in federal custody, the syndicate now aware of her name, Mara alone in her apartment 23 blocks from wherever this car was going. 5 seconds. Then she sat up. Mara, she said. 2 of my people are outside her building, Luca said. She's inside. She's safe. Does she know they're there? No. She can't know they're there. She'll call me and I won't be able to explain. She won't see them. He said it with the confidence of a man whose people were good at not being seen. Elena nodded once and filed it and moved forward because backward was not available. The account numbers, she said. The routing identifiers. If I give them to the federal prosecutors now, the uncorrupted ones, whoever isn't the source, does it move fast enough to matter? It depends on how fast the syndicate moves. If they believe you have the numbers and that we're about to deliver them, they'll try to pull the assets before the freeze can land. He looked at her steadily. Which means the window between you providing the information and the freeze executing is the most dangerous period. How long is that window? With the right judge and a clean chain to the right prosecutor, 6 hours, maybe less. And with a corrupted chain? Longer than we have. The car stopped in front of a building on the west side that looked like nothing in particular, mid-rise, residential, the kind of building that existed in every expensive city as pure anonymity, its purpose to contain without advertising. Caruso cut the engine and got out and opened Elena's door, and she stepped onto the sidewalk and looked up at the building and then at Luca beside her. "What is this?" she said. "Somewhere not on any documentation connected to my name or my organization." He moved toward the entrance. "It belongs to an attorney who owes me a significant courtesy." Inside was an apartment on the 9th floor that looked like a place someone lived when they traveled enough that living felt provisional. Good furniture that nobody had broken in, a kitchen with equipment and no evidence of cooking, books on shelves in an order that suggested they'd been arranged rather than read. Clean, quiet, anonymous. Caruso checked the rooms efficiently and came back and nodded and took a position near the door. There were 2 other men Elena hadn't seen before, posted at positions in the apartment she registered without staring at. The kind of men who stood in ways that made clear they were always ready to be doing something other than standing. Luca went to the kitchen and poured 2 glasses of water and brought them to the table and sat down. And Elena sat across from him and drank because her throat was dry and her shoulder was sending steady signals of objection and she needed to be functional. "Tell me the process," she said. "Exactly, for getting the information to the right people." "I have an attorney, separate from the building's owner, who has a direct relationship with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Not the investigative team, the office itself. We bypass the task force and go directly to the prosecutorial level. That skips the corrupted source. If the source is at the investigative level, yes. And if it isn't?" He looked at her across the table. "Then we're working with a shorter window than 6 hours." She drank the rest of the water and set the glass down and folded her hands on the table in front of her, and thought about the sequence. The numbers existed in her memory in the specific way all her professional knowledge existed, not as a list she could recite mechanically, but as a spatial structure, a set of relationships she could navigate. She had tested this over the past 2 years without meaning to, checking the accuracy of her recall the way you checked a healed injury, pressing it to see if it held. It held. The architecture was intact, all of it, the routing identifiers and the account designations and the 2-letter country codes, and the specific sequencing of the layered transfers that made the structure legible from the inside and opaque from the outside. She could write it down in 40 minutes. She could hand 40 minutes of her memory to the right person and end 2 years of a particular kind of captivity in a single motion. "Get your attorney on the phone," she said. Luca reached into his jacket. The window to Elena's left exploded inward. Not the glass, the frame, the entire assembly, blown inward by an impact she felt in her chest before she heard it, a pressure wave that preceded the sound by a fraction of a second. And then the sound arrived and it was enormous. And the lamp in the corner went out and Caruso shouted something in Italian, and the 2 men who'd been standing at their positions were already moving, and Luca was across the table and his hand was on Elena's arm, and he was pulling her out of the chair and down below the level of the table before she'd processed what was happening. "Stay below the windows," he said, directly into her ear, his voice entirely level, and that levelness was the most stabilizing thing in the room. She stayed below the windows. The apartment was dark now, except for the city light coming through the blown frame, painting the floor in orange-gray shapes. She heard voices outside the door. Caruso's and another voice were rapid and controlled, and the sound of movement from the hallway, from the stairwell, from somewhere below that transmitted through the floor as a vibration she felt in her knees. "How many?" Luca said. Not to her, to Caruso across the room. "Minimum 4. Building entry 3 minutes ago. They burned through the security feed. Elevator? Locked out. They're on the stairs. Luca's hand was still on her arm, not gripping, just present, and she could feel his pulse through that contact, elevated, controlled, the pulse of a man who was scared the way competent people were scared, which was cleanly and without the noise of panic. She matched her breathing to the rhythm of it, in, out. Her shoulder was screaming. She filed it. There's a service corridor, Luca said, behind the kitchen. It connects to the secondary stairwell on the north side of the building. He looked at her. Can you run? Yes. Your shoulder. I said yes. He held her eyes for 1 second, assessing, and she held his back, and he nodded. They moved through the dark apartment low and fast, Caruso ahead with one of the other men, Luca behind Elena, the kitchen tile cold through her kitchen shoes. Caruso pushed through the door at the back of the kitchen, and they were in a concrete service corridor, bare bulb overhead, smelling like cleaning supplies and old building. The door at the far end of the corridor showed a green exit sign. Behind them, through the apartment door, she heard the sound of the hallway door giving. Caruso hit the stairwell door and held it, and they went through, and then they were on the stairs, going down, concrete under their feet, the sound echoing in the shaft. Elena counted floors by the landings. 8, 7, 6. Her left arm pressed against her body, keeping the shoulder still, her right hand trailing the railing. She was fast on stairs. She had always been fast on stairs, had run them in every kitchen she'd ever worked, up and down from prep floors and storage levels and walk-in coolers, and her legs knew how to do this even when the rest of her was operating in conditions they'd never been designed for. 4, 3. The stairwell door above them opened. Move, Luca said, and his voice had dropped the levelness, gone to something flatter and more urgent. And she moved, they all moved, and at the second-floor landing, Caruso went left through a door instead of continuing down, and she followed without questioning it, into another corridor, this one with carpet, residential, apartment doors on both sides. Caruso was on his phone, moving and talking simultaneously. At the end of the corridor, a window looked out onto the alley beside the building, and below the window was the roof of the adjacent structure, maybe a 10-foot drop, and Elena looked at it and understood before Caruso said anything. No, she said. It's the only line that isn't covered, Caruso said. My shoulder. Land on your feet and roll right. He said it clinically as a technical instruction, which she found she could accept better than concern would have been. Don't try to catch yourself with your left arm, all right? She looked at the window, 10 feet. She had dropped from taller things in her life. Not with a compromised shoulder, but she had dropped from taller things. Luca was beside her. I'll go first, he said. Why? So I'm there when you land. He said it without sentiment as a logistical point. She looked at him and something moved through her chest that was not the time for, that she filed along with the shoulder pain in the compartment for things that required processing later. Fine, she said. He went through the window and dropped and landed, and she heard his feet on the roof below, a clean impact. And then she went through, feet first, her right hand on the sill, releasing at the last possible moment, and the drop was fast, and the landing was hard, and she rolled right the way Caruso had said, her right shoulder taking the impact and absorbing it, and Luca's hands were on her before she'd fully stopped moving, steadying, and she got her feet under her and stood. Her left shoulder felt like it had been hit with something heavy. She breathed through it, once, twice. I'm up, she said. Caruso and the second man landed behind them. They moved across the rooftop toward a fire escape on the far side, and the city spread out around them in every direction, its light enormous and indifferent, orange and white against the black sky. And Elena moved through it with Luca's hand briefly at her back guiding direction, and then releasing because she didn't need guiding. She had the fire escape in her sight, and she was moving toward it. The street below was empty. They went down the fire escape fast and dropped the last section and hit the sidewalk, and a car was already there. Different car, different driver, nobody she'd seen before. And they got in, and it pulled away from the curb before Caruso had fully closed the door. Elena sat in the back seat with Luca beside her, and she breathed, and her shoulder translated its objections through her entire left side, and she let it do that and breathed around it. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them as a scientific observation, not a judgment. Adrenaline. Normal response. Hands could shake and still function. She knew this. She had known this since the night 2 years ago, when her hands had shaken exactly this way while she packed a bag in the dark with Adrian asleep in the other room, and she had packed the bag anyway, every item precise, nothing forgotten. "Where are we going?" she said. "Federal Building," Lucas said. "Downtown." "Now." "Now." She looked at him. He had a cut along his jawline from the window glass, not deep, bleeding slowly, and he hadn't touched it. "Your attorney," she said. "Already called. He's meeting us there." He looked at her left shoulder. "When this is over, you're getting that looked at." "When this is over," she said, "I'll consider it." The city moved past the windows, the streets emptying as they went south, the buildings changing character, the residential giving way to the institutional, the civic, the granite and glass of lower Manhattan. Elena watched it go and thought about Diane Yo, who had spent 16 months building something, who had called her a friend when they hadn't spoken in 2 years, who had been killed 7 hours after a phone call. She thought about what kind of person spent 16 months on a story that got her killed, and felt, underneath the grief that was waiting for its proper time, something like recognition, the particular stubbornness of a person who decided they were going to see something through regardless of the cost, who had looked at the cost and chosen the thing anyway. She understood that person. She was about to become her. The federal building was not what she'd expected, which was nothing in particular. A building was a building. What she hadn't expected was the speed of it, the attorney meeting them in the lobby. A compact man in his 60s named Hess, who shook her hand without preamble and looked at her left shoulder and pointedly did not mention it. And then they were in an elevator and then a conference room that smelled like carpet and recycled air and had a table with a legal pad and 2 pens in the center of it. An assistant U.S. attorney arrived 9 minutes later. Her name was Reyes, and she was somewhere in her mid-30s, and she shook Elena's hand and sat down across from her and put a recorder on the table and said, "Ms. Vale, I understand you have information relevant to a pending financial conspiracy matter. I want to make clear that nothing you say here can be used against you personally, and that—" "I know," Elena said. "I've been thinking about this conversation for 2 years. Can we skip the preamble?" Reyes looked at her for a moment, then at the recorder, then back. "Okay," she said. "Let's start." Elena started. She talked for 41 minutes without stopping, without notes, without any reference except the interior architecture of her own memory, and what came out was exact and sequenced and complete. The routing identifiers in order, the account designations with their country suffixes, the specific layer structure of the transfers as she had seen it on the screen of a laptop in an apartment she had left 2 years ago, organized by the precise memory of a woman who had spent her professional life understanding that the exact quantity of a thing was the difference between what worked and what didn't. Reyes stopped her twice to clarify notation. Elena clarified. She kept talking. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Reyes stood up and went to the door and spoke to someone outside in a low voice, and there was movement in the hallway, and Elena sat at the table with her hands flat on its surface, and her shoulder aching and her voice feeling scraped, and she looked at the legal pad in front of her, covered in Reyes' handwriting, shorthand, fast, every notation captured, and she felt the specific lightness of something set down after a long carry. Luca was sitting against the wall behind her. She hadn't looked at him during the 41 minutes. She turned now. He was watching her with the same steady creek water attention he'd turned on her that first morning, the morning with the cannoli and the yellow kitchen light and the question nobody was supposed to ask. The cut along his jaw had dried. "It's enough?" she said. "It's more than enough." "How long for the freeze?" He looked at his watch. "It's 3:47 a.m. If Reyes moves in the next 20 minutes, the accounts can be frozen before markets open in Europe." She nodded. She turned back to the table. She put her right hand flat on the legal pad, on top of 41 minutes of her memory, and pressed down once, firmly, the way she pressed the laminated pastry when she needed the layers to hold. The door opened. Reyes came back in, and behind her were 2 people Elena didn't know, and the expression on Reyes' face was controlled in a way that had urgency underneath it. The same way Elena's face was controlled most of the time, function over feeling, the expression of someone managing a gap between what was happening and what they could show. "Ms. Vale," Reyes said, "I need to ask you to remain in this building." Elena looked at her. "Why?" We've had a communication in the last 10 minutes from the syndicate's attorneys. She paused, and the pause had weight. They've obtained an emergency injunction claiming that evidence gathered through Moretti-affiliated channels constitutes improper inducement. They're attempting to block the account freeze pending a hearing. The room went very quiet. Elena heard Luca stand up behind her. That's not possible, Hess said. The information was provided voluntarily and directly to— I know what it was, Reyes said. The judge they filed with is— She stopped, and the way she stopped told Elena everything she needed to know about the corrupted source and where it sat and how high it went. It's complicated. Elena looked at Reyes. Reyes looked at Elena. How long? Elena said. The hearing is scheduled for 6 a.m. 2 hours. Yes. And in 2 hours, if the injunction holds. Reyes took a breath. The accounts move. The architecture dissolves. The case— Another pause. The case becomes significantly more difficult to prosecute. Elena stood up from the table. She stood up with the legal pad in her right hand, 41 minutes of her memory in Reyes's shorthand, and she held it and looked at the two people behind Reyes she didn't know, and then at Luca and then at Reyes. The judge who issued the emergency hearing, she said. Is there a judge above them who can override it in the next 2 hours? Reyes's expression shifted by a degree, theoretically. What does that require? Direct application, with supporting documentation substantial enough to— Reyes stopped and something in her face recalibrated, a competent person arriving at an idea they hadn't had before. It would require a personal appearance before a federal circuit judge, at 4 a.m. Which one? Reyes looked at her for a long moment. I know one who would hear this. Then let's go, Elena said. She moved toward the door. Luca stepped to her side without being asked, Caruso behind him, and they went into the hallway, and Elena moved through the federal building at 4 a.m. with her left shoulder on fire and the legal pad in her right hand and the knowledge of everything she'd carried for 2 years finally, in other hands, in the right hands, moving toward the place where it could do the thing it had always been capable of doing. Behind them, in the conference room, she heard Reyes already on the phone, her voice low and fast and entirely certain. Ahead of them, the elevator opened. They walked toward it, and as they did, Elena heard, somewhere in the building below them, transmitted through floors and walls and the concrete bones of the structure, the sound of raised voices, the sound of men who had arrived somewhere and found it not the way they'd expected it to be. The sound of the syndicate's people realizing that the window they'd thought they had was closing faster than anyone had told them it would. The elevator closed. Elena looked at her reflection in the polished metal doors. She looked like someone who had been in a kitchen at 4 a.m, and then in an alley at midnight, and then through a blown window and down a fire escape, and across a rooftop and into a federal building. She looked like every night of the past 2 years had arrived simultaneously, like the interest had come due. She looked exactly like herself. Luca's reflection was beside hers, the cut on his jaw, the suit that had started the evening as charcoal and was now something less definable. He was looking at her reflection, not at himself, and when she met his eyes in the metal, she saw something she'd been watching arrive in increments since 4:30 in the morning. Not warmth exactly, nothing that soft, but a specific and serious attention that had survived everything the last 20 hours had put it through and was still there, unchanged in its quality, which was the most honest thing she knew how to read in another person. The elevator opened on the lobby. Reyes was already there with her coat on and her phone to her ear, and the expression of a woman who had been waiting 2 years for the right witness to walk through a door and had just found her. Outside, through the glass lobby doors, the city was the deep pre-dawn dark that came just before the sky began to change. The last hour of genuine night. The city still running, but quieter now. The streets belonging to the people who worked in the dark, and the people who hadn't slept, and the people who were about to do something that would look, from the outside, like a very small thing. One woman, one legal pad, one building, one judge at 4 a.m, and would be, from the inside, the end of something that had lasted 2 years longer than it should have, and the beginning of something neither she nor the man standing beside her had a clean word for yet. Caruso pushed through the lobby door and held it, and Elena walked through it into the last dark hour of the city, and the cold hit her like a clean hand, and she didn't stop. She kept walking, because stopping was the one thing she had never once been willing to do, and she was not going to learn it now, not when the finish line was 2 hours and one federal judge away from everything she had carried every morning under a leather apron in a lit kitchen while the city slept, and the work went on, and the collarbone ached its silent. The federal circuit judge's name was Alderman, and he lived in a townhouse in Tribeca that looked like every other townhouse on the block except for the security camera above the door that tracked them as they came up the steps at 4:19 in the morning. His clerk, a young woman in a coat thrown over pajamas who had clearly been called from sleep and had come anyway, which told Elena something about the kind of judge Alderman was, opened the door before Reyes had finished knocking. They were put in a study on the ground floor while the clerk went upstairs. The study smelled like old paper and coffee that had been sitting for hours. Bookshelves floor to ceiling, a desk with case files stacked in a system only their owner understood, a single lamp already on, as though the room had been expecting company. Elena stood near the window and did not sit because sitting would allow her shoulder to stiffen in a way she couldn't afford for the next hour, and she breathed carefully and looked at the street outside. Empty, wet from a rain that had come and gone while they were in the federal building, the pavement reflecting the streetlights in long orange smears. Luca stood beside her. Neither of them spoke. Caruso was in the hallway. Reyes was reviewing her notes at the desk, her pen moving in tight, fast strokes. Hess was on his phone in the corner, speaking too quietly to hear. At 4:26, Judge Alderman came downstairs. He was in his 70s, compact, with white hair cut close, and the eyes of a man who had been reading documents at odd hours for so long that wakefulness had simply become his default condition. He wore a cardigan over a collared shirt. He looked at Reyes first, then at Elena, and the quality of attention he turned on her was different from every other quality of attention she'd experienced in the past 24 hours. It was neither strategic, nor protective, nor assessing. It was simply the attention of someone determining whether a person in front of them was telling the truth. "Ms. Vale," he said, "I understand you've had a difficult evening." "Yes, sir. I've read the summary Counselor Reyes provided." He moved to the desk and picked up the legal pad, and Elena watched him read. Not skim, read, his eyes moving with the deliberate pace of someone who understood that the numbers on the page were not numbers but architecture, not data but the map of a system designed to move money through darkness without leaving shadows. He turned 3 pages. He turned back to the first. He set it down. He looked at her. "You memorized this," he said. "Yes." 2 years ago." "Yes." "And you've carried it." She held his eyes. "I didn't have anywhere else to put it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The injunction filed this morning is before Judge Carrington in the Southern District. I'm familiar with the circumstances." He said it without elaboration, which was itself an elaboration. "You understand that what I'm considering doing, overriding an emergency injunction at 4:30 in the morning on the basis of a personal appearance, is procedurally extraordinary." "I understand." "It will be challenged." "It will hold," Reyes said from across the room. "The documentation is complete. The chain of information is clean. The injunction was filed on procedurally defective grounds and was granted by—" She stopped, and Elena heard the same stop she'd heard in the conference room, the careful navigation around the name of a compromised thing. "The injunction won't survive the morning." Alderman looked at Reyes for a moment, then back at Elena. "Ms. Vale, the accounts in question, if they're moved before the freeze executes, the case collapses," Elena said. "I know, Counselor Reyes told me, and the people who killed Diane Yo," she said the name directly, cleanly, because Diane deserved to be named in the room where decisions about her death were being made. "Walk away from it, all of it." Alderman absorbed that. He picked up a pen. He signed the order at 4:31 a.m. Reyes was on her phone before the ink was dry, and Elena heard her voice shift into operational register. Not the careful, measured tone of the conference room, but the fast, certain voice of someone executing something they'd been building toward for a long time. And in that shift, Elena heard 16 months of Diane Yo's work arriving at its destination through a route Diane hadn't lived to see. And she stood in the judge's study and felt that landing somewhere that didn't have a clean name. Luca's hand found her right arm, briefly. Just the pressure of it, just presence, and then released. Outside, the night was beginning to lose its absolute quality. Not light yet, but the specific darkness of pre-dawn, the darkness that knew it was almost over. They were back in the car at 4:47. Caruso drove without being told where, which meant Luca had communicated something she hadn't seen. They moved through streets that were beginning to show the earliest evidence of the city waking. A delivery truck, a man with a dog, the lights of a diner casting yellow rectangles onto the wet sidewalk. Elena sat in the back seat and let her shoulder hurt properly for the first time all night, stopped managing it, just let it report what it needed to report. The long, deep ache of a joint that had been compensating for a structural injury for 2 years and was done pretending otherwise. "It's over," she said. She said it quietly, testing it. "The freeze will execute when European markets open," Luca said. 40 minutes. "And Adrian will be arraigned this morning. The financial charges, the extortion, the assault." He paused. "And now conspiracy in relation to Diane Yo, when the prosecutors have what they need from tonight. He'll say he didn't order it. He didn't need to order it. He gave them your name. That's enough." She thought about that, about the precise economy of it. Adrian had not needed to pick up a phone or say a specific word. He had simply allowed the information to reach the people who would act on it, and Diane Yo was dead, and Adrian's hands were, in the technical sense he would certainly exploit, clean. She thought about 2 years of Adrian's particular genius for exactly this, for achieving outcomes without fingerprints, for standing at the correct distance from the things he caused. The charges would hold. She believed that. She had to believe that. "And the source inside the federal investigation," she said. "Reyes is managing that this morning." He said it in a way that made clear he would not be more specific, which was fine. She was done needing to know the specific mechanics of things she couldn't affect. The car stopped. She looked out the window. They were on her block. Her building, the one with the dented mailboxes, and the superintendent who left the lobby door propped open on warm nights, was 20 feet away. The windows of her apartment on the 4th floor were dark. "How did you know where I live?" she said, and then, "Never mind." "The 2 men from tonight are gone," Luca said. "Reyes has 2 federal officers stationed outside your building as of 20 minutes ago. Standard witness protection protocol." She nodded. She looked at her building. She thought about the coffee tin above the refrigerator with the dented lid, the $400 that weren't in it anymore. She thought about Mara's specialist appointment in 9 days, and the physical therapy invoice, and the long, patient, enormous weight of the debt she'd been managing. And she thought about Luca's voice in the dining room saying, "It costs you nothing," and the way she'd looked at his face when he'd said it, trying to find the angle, the price, the thing he wasn't saying. She thought maybe he just meant it. She wasn't ready to know what to do with that yet. "I need to sleep," she said. "Yes. And then I need to see Mara." "Of course." She reached for the door handle and stopped. She turned and looked at him in the back seat of the car, in the pre-dawn dark, the cut on his jaw dried now, his suit beyond recovery, his face carrying the full weight of the night with the same steadiness he'd carried everything else. Not without cost. She could see the cost, but not broken by it. Not anywhere close to broken. "The cannoli," she said. He looked at her. "This morning, when you tasted it." She held his eyes. "Was that actually why you came in early? Because you wanted to taste the cannoli?" He was quiet for a moment. "I come in early sometimes," he said. "I wanted to see the kitchen before service." A pause. "The cannoli was better than I expected." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He looked at her steadily. "I'd been watching you work for 8 months. I wanted to know if what I thought I understood about what I was watching was accurate." "And?" "It was more accurate than I'd thought." She looked at him for one more moment, and then she opened the door and got out. And the morning air was cold and smelled like wet pavement and the distant exhaust of the city coming awake. And she stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the dark windows of her apartment. "Elena," he said, from inside the car. She turned. "I'm sorry about your friend," he said. She looked at him. "Me too," she said. She went inside. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it. The mug from yesterday morning still in the drying rack, the chair by the window with her reading jacket thrown over the back, the coffee tin above the refrigerator with the dented lid. She stood in the kitchen in the dark and put her hand on the counter, the laminate edge of it, nothing as fine as marble, just the ordinary surface she'd stood at 10,000 mornings, and she let the silence of the apartment settle around her. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair by the window and watched the sky change, the darkness thinning at the edges, the black going to deep blue and then to gray, the buildings across the way acquiring definition, and somewhere around 5:40, the first real light arrived, pale and without commitment, the light of a city that had been through the night and was beginning the calculation of the day. At 6:03, her phone buzzed. A news alert. Financial. The language was technical and dry and said, in the careful vocabulary of financial journalism, that a significant asset freeze had been executed across a network of shell corporations connected to an ongoing federal investigation. The trading in several associated instruments had been suspended pending review, and that a spokesperson for the U.S. Attorney's Office had confirmed the investigation was active and charges were expected. She read it twice. She put the phone down. She sat with the ordinary silence of her apartment and felt, in the way you felt things that were too large for a single feeling, the aggregate of what the past 24 hours had done. The numbers were out of her. The architecture she'd carried in her memory like a stone in a pocket, for 2 years, constant, present. Its weight so familiar she'd stopped noticing it and then noticed it again now by its absence. She pressed her right hand against her left shoulder and felt the ache, which was exactly the same as it had been yesterday morning, which was a different thing than it had been yesterday morning. The same pain, different meaning. She called Mara at 8:15. Mara answered on the second ring, sounding like someone who'd been awake for a while, and said, "I was about to call you. There's something weird going on outside my building. Are those federal people?" "Yes," Elena said. A pause. "Should I be scared?" "No." She meant it. "I'll come over and explain. Can I come over? Can you bring food? Real food, not hospital cafeteria food. I'll bring food." She made the call she'd been dreading for 2 years, about things she'd been hiding for 2 years, and she sat in the chair by the window with the light coming in stronger now, real morning light, and she talked to her sister for 40 minutes and told her most of it. And some of it she simplified and some of it she left for later, when Mara was steadier, when she was steadier, when there was time to build toward the truth instead of arriving at it all at once. Mara cried. Elena cried. Then Mara said, "You should have told me," in the voice of someone who was angry and scared, and also, underneath both of those, relieved, the relief of a person who has sensed a wrong shape to things for a long time and is now being given the actual shape, however terrible. "I know," Elena said. "You always do everything alone." "I know. It's really annoying." "I know that too." Mara made a sound that was almost a laugh, wet at the edges. "Come over," she said. "Bring something from that bakery on Amsterdam, the one with the almond croissants." "Okay." And Elena. A pause. "The debt. All that money. Are you really—" "It's handled," Elena said. "I promise." She meant that too. She showered and changed and went out into the morning with the federal officers noting her exit in the professional peripheral way of people paid to be aware without being visible. And she walked the 6 blocks to the bakery on Amsterdam and bought almond croissants and a container of coffee, and then walked the 14 blocks to Mara's building. And the city was fully awake around her now, the morning rush in its early stages, people moving with the directed urgency of ordinary days. And Elena moved through it and felt the specific strangeness of ordinary days following extraordinary nights. The way the world continued its regular business without acknowledgement of the thing that had shifted inside it. She spent 3 hours with Mara. They sat at Mara's kitchen table and ate the croissants, and Elena answered questions until the questions ran out. And then they sat quietly, the way sisters sit when they've talked about the hard thing and the talking is finished and what remains is just the fact of each other. Present, intact. Before she left, Mara reached across the table and put her hand over Elena's right hand. She didn't say anything. She just left it there for a moment, warm and certain, the hand of someone who had been through her own long reckoning with physical damage and the limits of what a body could endure, and the question of what remained when endurance was the only tool you had. Elena turned her hand over and held her sister's hand and looked at the table and breathed. She left at noon. 3 weeks later, Adrian Locke pleaded guilty. He did it without a trial, which his attorney had advised, and which Elena understood was its own kind of strategy. Minimize exposure, control the narrative, avoid the specific and detailed testimony that a trial would require. He pleaded to financial crimes, extortion, assault, racketeering, and conspiracy. The conspiracy charge, related to Diane Yo, carried weight that the financial crimes alone would not have. And it was the conspiracy charge that produced the sentence Elena read about on a Tuesday morning in a newspaper she'd bought from the stand on the corner of 6th and 23rd. She read it standing on the sidewalk in the morning foot traffic, and then folded the paper and put it in her bag and walked the rest of the way to work. The source inside the federal investigation, a task force analyst who had been on the syndicate's payroll for 4 years, was indicted separately, 6 weeks after Adrian's plea. Elena read about that one online, sitting in the prep room on the second floor of Casa Nero, on an afternoon in June when the light through the window to the courtyard was doing something particular with the new leaves on the bare tree that had stopped being bare sometime in May. The fraudulent debt attached to Mara's medical accounts was expunged in its entirety through a process Elena never fully understood, handled by attorneys she never met, and she chose not to fully understand it because some things you accepted as the cost of what you'd done without requiring a complete accounting of the mechanism. Mara's specialist cleared her for a reduced therapy schedule in July. Progress, not resolution. The kind of progress that meant living with what remained, which was its own form of resolution. Elena's surgery was scheduled for the second week of August. She had put it off twice, once because she didn't trust the stillness of the recovery period, and once because she was finishing something that needed to be finished first. The something was a proposal, 40 pages, detailed, budgeted, architecturally specific. For a culinary institute she had spent 3 months designing with the specific knowledge of a woman who understood what it meant to need a professional path and have no road to it. The institute would offer education, legal assistance, counseling, and paid apprenticeships to survivors of domestic violence. It would occupy a space she'd identified in the West Village, a former industrial kitchen that had been sitting empty for 2 years and that had bones she recognized as right. She brought the proposal to Luca on a Thursday afternoon in late July, in the private dining room where they'd sat the night everything broke open. She put it on the table in front of him and sat across from him and did not say anything while he read it, all 40 pages beginning to end, with the same attention he'd given the account architecture in Judge Alderman's study. Not looking for the bottom line, but reading the structure, understanding how the pieces related to each other, what held the whole thing up. When he finished, he set it down. He looked at her. "The Ash Kitchen Institute," he said. "Yes." "You named it." "I did." He looked at the proposal for a moment and then back at her. "The budget is accurate. The legal framework for the victim services component. I had help from an attorney, pro bono." She held his eyes. "The institute operates independently, entirely. My board, my staff, my decisions. I understand that. I mean it specifically in relation to you." He looked at her without evasion. "I know you do. I'm not looking for a patron. I'm looking for an investor who understands that the return is not financial and is not reciprocal obligation." He picked up the proposal again and turned to the budget page and looked at it for a moment. Then he set it down and looked at her, and something moved across his face that she'd been watching arrive in increments for 3 months. Not the controlled attention of a man assessing an asset, not the strategic warmth of the first morning, but something that had been stripped down to its actual content by everything that had happened between that morning and this afternoon. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "That's it?" she said. "What else would you like me to say?" She thought about it. "Nothing," she said. "Yes is enough." The institute opened on a Monday in November, on a morning that was cold and clear, the sky the specific blue of late autumn. the kind of blue that had no sentiment in it, just light. Elena arrived at 6:30 to oversee the final setup, moving through the new kitchen with the proprietary knowledge of someone who had designed every element of the space and then let other hands build it, and was now reclaiming it in the way you reclaimed something you'd made, by walking through it and finding it real. The equipment was right. The flow from prep to instruction to plating was right. The offices adjacent to the kitchen, for the legal staff, for the counselors, were separate but not distant, which she'd insisted on through 3 rounds of architectural revision, because proximity without intrusion was the specific thing she'd been trying to build. On the wall beside the entrance, inside a glass case, hung the leather apron. The oversized one, men's workwear brand, the left shoulder slightly worn where she'd held it against her body for 8 months. No plaque, no explanation. She had written nothing to accompany it because everything it was had already been said by its existence, by the specific size of it, by the way it had served its purpose and been set aside. The first staff arrived at 7. By 9, the first students were coming through the door, 12 of them in the inaugural cohort, 12 women at various distances from the thing they'd survived, all of them carrying the specific posture of people who had learned to make themselves smaller and were in the process of unlearning it, which was the longest kind of learning. Elena shook each hand and looked each person in the eye and said their name, the way she'd wanted someone to say hers. And she did not make speeches about resilience or survival or strength, because those words had been emptied by overuse. And what she wanted to give these women was not more language but equipment, knives that balanced correctly, stations designed for efficiency, the specific competence of hands that knew what they were doing. She taught the first class herself. Pastry. Cannoli dough, because it was honest work, because it required precision and patience and the willingness to be corrected by the material itself when you got the tension wrong. And because it produced something that people received with uncomplicated pleasure, and there was value. She had come to understand in producing things that people received that way. At 11 o'clock, Luca arrived. He came through the front door in the coat she'd seen him wear in November, and he looked at the space with the attention he gave all spaces he entered, and then he looked at the apron in the case beside the entrance, and he stood in front of it for a moment without speaking. She watched him from across the room. She watched him look at the apron and then look at her, and she understood that he was making the same connection she'd made when she'd put it there, tracing the line from the thing in the case to the woman across the room, and understanding the distance between the two as something that had been traveled at significant cost and had arrived somewhere real. He crossed the room. He stood in front of the tasting counter where she'd been plating the class samples, and he looked at the small cannoli on the plate in front of her, a different recipe than the one he'd tasted in February, refined through 6 months of iteration, the orange and the oil more present now, the ricotta strained an additional hour, the pistachio crushed finer, and he picked one up. He tasted it. He was quiet for a moment. "It's better than the one from February," he said. "It should be," she said. "I've had 8 more months." He set the plate down and looked at her directly, the way he'd looked at her that first morning in the kitchen, but different now. Not assessing, not calculating, not managing anything, just looking at her the way you looked at someone you'd been through something with and were still standing next to on the other side of it. "How does it feel?" he said. "Today." She looked around the kitchen, at the students bent over their stations, at the instructors moving between them, at the light coming through the windows she'd specified at their current height to illuminate the work without creating glare, at the apron in its case by the door. "Like something that belongs to me," she said. He nodded. She reached up with her right hand and touched her left collarbone, not searching for pain, not running the old diagnostic, checking the boundary, measuring the limit, just touching it. The healed ridge of it beneath her fingers, the changed topography of a place that had been broken and reset and built back stronger in the way that things built back sometimes were, though not always, and not without cost, and not without the permanent record of what had happened written into the bone itself. She felt it, and she let it be what it was, and she took her hand away. "I need to get back to the class," she said. "Of course." She turned toward her students, then she stopped. She turned back. "The question you asked me," she said, "that first morning, why are you hiding the man who broke your collarbone?" She looked at him. Did you know what it would do when you asked it? He considered that for a moment with the genuine consideration of a man who did not give false answers to real questions. I knew it would change something, he said. I didn't know what. She held his eyes. Neither did I, she said. She went back to her students. Behind her, she heard him stay. Not leaving, not intruding, just present in the new kitchen on its first morning, the way you stayed in a space that had earned the right to exist by the work that had built it. The students were working, their hands in the dough, the kitchen warm and smelling like butter and citrus, and the specific living smell of something being made for the first time in a place that would make it many times more. Elena moved between the stations and corrected a tension here, a technique there. Her voice even and direct. Her hands demonstrating without taking over. Her left shoulder carrying its permanent reminder with the ordinary patience of a healed thing. Outside the windows, the November morning was doing what November mornings did. Holding its cold light without apology, without warmth, without any particular concern for what happened beneath it. It was enough. It was exactly enough. And in the kitchen, under that light, 12 women stood at their stations and learned the precise and patient work of their own hands, and Elena Vale moved among them, and the morning continued in the ordinary way of mornings after the extraordinary has finished, quietly, with full attention, one task at a time, beginning.